Sports Store in 5 minutes. Now today I'm going to talk about concussion in rugby union. Look briefly at the law surrounding concussion, how concussion is currently dealt with in rugby, and the future of how it will and perhaps should be dealt with in the sport. Now, currently incidents of concussion are on the rise. If you look at the 2013-2014 Aviva Premiership season, there was a 59% increase compared to the season before, which basically meant that it was the third successive season that concussion was the most common injury in the sport. Even last season, 2014-15, there were 645 incidents of concussion. Why that's on the rise, in terms of tackling technique and size of the players, it is a debate for another day. What I'm going to look at is what that means for the clubs, for the doctors dealing with these incidents. Now, let's look briefly at the law in this area. So if a player gets concussed, then the responsibility for that player's welfare has a number of different elements. That responsibility is known as a duty of care. So governing bodies like the RFU have a duty of care towards players, and they set the rules and the regulations, particularly with scrums and things like that, with dangerous areas of the sport. Also doctors and rugby clubs as well have a duty of care. Now, if a player can prove that this duty has been breached, and that breach has subsequently caused loss to the player, then they may be able to subsequently obtain damages. It's worth remembering at this point the law of vicarious liability in England and Wales, where basically you can sue the employer for the actions of an employee. So if a doctor is negligent in his treatment of a player, you can sue the rugby club in question, often better anyway, as the rugby club have got more money, basically. One example I want to look at in particular is the Canadian lot called Jamie Cudmore. Now, while he was playing for Clermont-Auvergne in France against Saracens last season, he failed the concussion. He went off the pitch, failed the concussion protocol, and was told he couldn't get back on the field. Later on in the game, his second row partner also had to come off, and Cudmore basically ended up going back on despite having failed the protocol. A couple of weeks later, Cudmore suffered a couple of concussions in the game. In a different game rather, the last of which resulted in him vomiting in the changing room, and then a week or so after that, in training, he passed out. Now, at that point, he stopped playing, but basically, Jamie Cudmore is now suing Clermont for medical negligence, claiming it took him 3 months to recover, and he's suffering as a result of the doctor's handling of the situation. I think what's interesting here that if cases like this don't settle and end up going to trial, they could set real precedent in this area. And bearing in mind the increases in concussion that I mentioned, this could potentially open the floodgates to tens, if not hundreds, of claims. Now, if it does go to trial, it'd be interesting to see how the courts apply existing case law. There's a case involving a youth player who played for Tottenham Hotspur called Radwan Hamid, and he collapsed while playing for the club and suffered brain damage. Now, the club were held liable, and the judge said basically that the doctors failed to identify these risks and ensure they were acted upon. The difficulty with concussion is that the effects of concussion can often be felt in later life. So actually identifying and quantifying the loss could be quite tricky. So if this case does go to trial, it will be interesting to see how that's dealt with. Now, what next? Well, I think rugby as a sport's been pretty proactive in dealing with concussion. This season in the Aviva Premiership, the RFU had announced the trialling of concussion videos, real-time concussion videos to help medical staff identify concussion and treat it better. I think the greatest difficulty in the sport is ensuring that the protocol in place is properly implemented. So it wasn't in the case of Jamie Cudmore. And I think the difficulty is that rugby is a very macho environment. Players aren't going to want to say they're hurt, their jobs are on the line. And the key is making sure that doctors are totally removed from the game situation. The game situation is irrelevant, and they are making a decision on the basis of the protocol and in the basis of what's in the best interest of the player. And I think for rugby clubs, if they want to avoid potential litigation, they need to bear that in mind. And essentially, the player's welfare, there's no ifs or buts. That really should be the absolute. That was Sports Law in 5. Thank you for watching.